Hey, well, good afternoon. Glad to see all of you guys as we are getting closer to the AP exam. We've got still some work to do. We've got about 2 full weeks or a week and a half that we can be doing some work to get caught up. And today, what I want to go ahead and do is I want to talk a little bit about um, indigenous responses to state expansion. One of the things that we've been talking about in the last few weeks has been, and we talked about industrialization. Good afternoon, Noah. We've been talking about industrialization and also something that resulted from that, which was imperialism. And that's what we're going to talk about today is that as European powers are expanding, as European powers are going global, what's happening is there's different ways that Native people are responding. One of the very first images that you have on your handout, there's a map that's color coded. And this map that's color coded, there's really three colors. There's red, which is land directly controlled by the Europeans. There was orange, land controlled by European settlers. And there's blue, land controlled by non-Europeans. If you look at the orange, that's land controlled by European settlers. And the biggest, most noticeable one there is the United States, that the United States, started off as British colonies. They were European settlers, and they eventually earned their independence. And then also all of South America as well, as we studied that there was these Latin American independence movements that occurred in South America. So we have these lands ruled by European settlers. But then we have areas, much of the globe in the end of the 1800s, the start of the 1900s, that is full on controlled by Europeans. And that's everything in red. In fact, if you take a look at that, we see parts of the world that once dominated are now being dominated themselves. Parts like India, controlled by Europeans. All of Africa, except for two countries of Africa, controlled by Europeans. You might remember that country in blue in East Africa, the oldest Christian country in all of Africa that was never successfully conquered, that's Ethiopia. And then we have this small blue dot on the far left that is Liberia. So most of Africa, we actually had a lesson called the Scramble for Africa, taken over by Europeans. And so on our first handout, our first line, it says, in response to European imperialism, we see growth in nationalist movements. Now, we've talked about nationalism before and how nationalism was what was responsible for bringing parts of the world like Italy together for the first time. We talked about nationalism being responsible for bringing Germany together for the first time. But now we also see nationalism coming from these native indigenous people. What are people going to do with their nationalist feelings? And now that the British have taken over, now that the Germans have taken over various people groups. And so what we're going to see is a couple of ways that nationalism from these indigenous, from these local people plays out. It says that many of these leaders of these indigenous people, of these independent movement, many of the leaders of these independence movements had European, we'll write down, Western styled education. Many of these leaders that would fight for independence, that would argue for independence, had Western style education. In other words, what happened was that as the British took over places like India, we'll see a lot of the leaders who could afford it, because there's still rich people in India. There's still like merchant families in India. And these really wealthy families, well, they would send their sons, they'd send their children to study in Europe. And guess what they're going to learn when they're in Europe? They're going to learn about the Enlightenment. They're going to learn about natural rights. They're going to learn about John Locke. And they're going to take those ideas they learned in Europe and they're going to bring them back with them to their country of origin. It says on your handout that they had been taught Enlightenment ideas, such as three of them. Number one, they were taught about natural rights, that you have natural or God-given rights. This is something that the Enlightenment stressed. You might remember that our own revolution was inspired by the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and we're endowed by our Creator with certain rights." These are rights that are not given to us because a government gives it to us. We don't have rights because a piece of paper gives it to us. The Enlightenment says that we have rights that are God-given rights. And God can give them, because God gives them to us, no man, no government can take them away. This was an idea that the Enlightenment was given to these native indigenous peoples, and they thought, well, if that's true for white people, how much more true, or how equally true is that true for us? Number two, they also came away with the belief in what's called sovereignty, that governments rule through the consent of the people. Governments rule through the consent of the people. What that means is that the only way governments can pass laws, the only way that governments can really dictate anything was through the consent, with the people saying, yes, we agree, with the governments making laws in a way that says, yeah, we're behind that. You have the consent of the people. And so what if the people of India don't consent to the British taking over? What if the people of India don't consent to the British ruling them? Well, they're going to be thinking about rebellion. Number three, we also have nationalism. This is pride in your ethnic or your national identity. We've talked about this many times, pride in your ethnic or national identity. And so if you have nationalism that brings places like Italy together, nationalism that brings places like Germany together, we also mentioned that nationalism can tear places apart. The Ottoman Empire is this multi-ethnic empire. And if everyone starts feeling like really proud of their ethnic identity, well, what happens when those groups want their independence? And that's going to be something that tears the Ottoman Empire apart. And we're going to see that nationalism is going to be growing in places like Africa and India, and they're going to want their own independence. It was partly, it says, the Western style education they received that inspired them to rebel. It was partly the Western style education they received that inspired them to rebel. So it's kind of ironic that the British come in and they set up schools and they say, hey, this is our culture, this is what we value. We love guys like John Locke. We love guys like, like Adam Smith. We love these principles like capitalism, like democracy. These are the documents we value. We value the English Bill of Rights. We value Magna Carta, all these different things. And it would be those very documents and those very things that would lead the British to be in a situation where they're actually sowing the seeds of the end of their empire. That's what's going to happen. That the very beliefs that they valued, the things that they stressed, those are the things they're going to end up hurting the British Empire. So we'll see that partly it was the Western style education that they received that inspired them to rebel. So let's look at our first region in particular. It says there's the nationalist movements in the Balkans. It says nationalism in the Balkan Peninsula was inspired, and there's going to be one revolution in Europe that has already happened. There's one revolution in Europe that kind of tore up the old regime, the old ways. Kings were killed, churches were closed, chaos ensued, and that revolution that inspired all other revolutions in all of Europe was the French Revolution. Nationalism in the Balkan Peninsula was inspired by the French Revolution. And basically, in the Balkan Peninsula, there's an image on your handout with the Balkan Peninsula. Everything there in blue. And each ethnic group desired independence in the Balkans. And so that's going to be a problem because there's so many different ethnic groups in the Ottoman Empire. And as everyone gets infused with a sense of nationalism, every group's going to be going their own way. Greece goes their own way. Different regions start breaking up. And partly because of this Ottoman Empire falling apart because of nationalism, this weakening Ottoman Empire was known. They had a nickname. They were called the Sick Man of Europe. They were called the Sick Man of Europe. And they were called that because the Ottoman Empire at one point was powerful, it was mighty, it was massive, and it was getting smaller and smaller as history was progressing. More and more of the Ottoman Empire was breaking off. It was called the Sick Man of Europe. It was not as powerful as it once was. Well, what about in the Americas, so North and South America? So going back just a little bit in time, back to the 1700s, you might remember that the British, well, they had dominated in North America with their defeat of France, that there was a couple different powers. Spain was kind of controlled Mexico and everything south. France had controlled Canada and Louisiana, the area we called the Louisiana Purchase. But there was a war between France and Britain, and they're rival countries. They never get along. And as a result of this war, the British defeat the French. Canada becomes part of the British Empire. And now, what are the British going to do with all this new land? Well, they're really concerned because all this new land has a lot of Native Americans. They don't want to allow the 13 colonists to expand to the west because they know that's just going to start fighting, and it's going to be their responsibility to pay for it. So they decide to make it off limits. They decide to draw a line along the Appalachian Mountains called the Proclamation of 1763. And this line limited colonial expansion to the west. It limited colonial expansion to the west. Basically, this line said no white people are allowed to move to the other side of that line. That way, we don't cause any problems to Native Americans. This proclamation recognized the land rights of Native people. And that was a big deal because for most encounters, white people didn't really count or recognize that Native Americans owned the land in any way. White people looked at the land and said, well, I don't see a farm on it like the way we would, so it must be up for grabs. And the British say, no, that's not right. This line said no white European settlers are going to cross it. There'll be no fighting. There'll be no problems. Native Americans own the land. Well, this was rejected by American colonials. The original 13 colonist colonials thought that this was the British, limiting them. They were taking away their rights. They were taking away their freedoms. And they said, you know what, we're just going to ignore that line. And upon independence, Americans began colonizing the Midwest, places like Ohio. So all these states, Ohio and Minnesota and Wisconsin, this is what we call the Midwest. And after the Americans get their independence, this area opens up to colonization for the first time. Now, what to do now that we're getting into contact with all these Native American people? Well, there's a couple different desires. One desire was the belief that we can make these Native Americans white, that they can become white culturally, they become like us, was what the founding fathers, some of them argued, that we can transform Native Americans to dressing like white people, to embracing white culture, to valuing white culture. And one group of people that really actually did this really well was the Cherokee. Since the Cherokee were people who assimilated to white culture. They assimilated, they copied white culture. In fact, here's a picture of Chief John Ross. He's a Cherokee leader. And look, he's dressed like a Western culture. He's got the outfit, the jacket, the shirt. He has left native cultural dress and has embraced Western culture. The Cherokee do really well in adopting white culture. In fact, the Cherokee adopted European methods of three different things. Number one, farming. That was the biggest thing that Europeans really wanted. They wanted Native Americans to stop hunting and gathering. They said, look, to be civilized is to farm. The Cherokee began farming. Actually, they later even owned slaves themselves. Number two, they created a form of writing. Pretty much no Native Americans in North America had any sort of alphabet or any writing, but the Cherokee did. And in fact, here's a picture on your handout of the Cherokee alphabet. And white Europeans were all about that because they wanted the Cherokee to have a way to write. They wanted them to have a Bible. They wanted them to convert to Christianity. And number three, the third way that the Cherokee adopted European cultural methods was by government. In fact, they wrote a constitution. They wrote a document that was a guideline for how to rule their people based on our Constitution. So if you were to look at the Cherokee people, like, wow, they did everything they were asked. They became white. They became white culturally. They did all these things. But all those things were not enough to save and protect the Cherokee. In fact, something happened that caused them to lose their land. After gold was discovered in their land, they were kicked out of Georgia. That's where many of their people were from. They were from Georgia, but no matter how white they became culturally, they dressed, they farmed, they owned slaves, they did all the things they were supposed to do. That wasn't enough to keep them on their land, and they were actually kicked out of their homeland of Georgia. They were forced to leave by a law passed in 1829 called the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act. And as a result of this Indian Removal Act, they were actually forced to go to the worst place ever, Oklahoma. So it wasn't just bad that they had to like lose their land. They actually got sent to Oklahoma. And so here's an example of Native people, and they embrace white culture. They do all the things that they're told they're supposed to, and it wasn't enough. We talked about this before. This is the Trail of Tears, and they are sent out of their homeland, and their resistance came through becoming as white as they could culturally, but it wasn't enough. Playing by the rules didn't save them. So other Native Americans said, well, if playing by the rules isn't going to save us, then we need to like try something different. We need to go beyond dressing like white people and writing down a language and having a constitution. We needed to appeal to something bigger. And so Native Americans at the end of the 1800s turned to like traditional religion, and there was something called the ghost dance movement. And this ghost dance movement is an example of a fancy word called millenarianism. Now, millenarianism, it says on your handout, there's a definition for it. It's a group. A millenarian group is one that claims the current society and its rulers are corrupt, unjust, or otherwise just full on wrong, and therefore they believe that they'll be destroyed soon by a powerful force. They believe that the government, the powers that be, will be destroyed soon by a powerful force. And so millenarians are people that believe basically the end of the world is just around the corner. And that because the governments are so bad or the leaders are so corrupt that spiritual forces are just about to come and turn everything around and destroy everything that we know. That word, millenarianism, comes from a word that's meaningful in Christianity. In Christianity, there's a word called the millennium, and that's like this 1,000-year period that Jesus in the New Testament is supposed to come back at the end of the world, and Jesus is supposed to like rule for 1,000 years. For Christians, the millennium is the end of the world, and we use that phrase to talk about any sort of movement that believes that there's going to be this judgment, this end of the world, that the old ways are going to be judged by spirits. And that's exactly what these Native Americans believed was going to happen. It says that Native Americans, after 1869, came to believe that the dead would come back to drive out the whites. They believed that their dead, that dead Native Americans, dead ancestors would rise from the dead. And in this supernatural end of the world experience, that the white people would be driven out of the land. The buffalo would come back. The land would be restored to Native American people. White people and their advance with trains and telegraph, that would all come to an end. And so they believed that there was something that they could do to bring this end of the world scenario. It was called the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a series of rituals meant to bring about the end of the world. The ghost dance was a series of rituals that these Native Americans practiced, and they said, if we do this, we're going to bring about the end of the world and the judgment of white people. Well, as you can imagine, they danced, but the end of the world never came. They danced, and white people remained. In fact, it says it came to an end at something called the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. And that's when the United States Army showed up at this place where they were participating in this ghost dance. And the United States Army killed 200 women and children. They killed 200 women and children and 90 men. And so because Wounded Knee is like this massacre and all these leaders died, a lot of them just like innocent women and children, this is like the last moment. Wounded Knee is like that last moment that Native American resistance has this meaningful moment. And so these Native Americans took a different approach than the Cherokee. They appealed to spiritual powers, thinking spiritual powers will help destroy white people. It didn't work out. Instead, white led army of the United States military came in, massacred innocent women and children. Well, what about other examples of imperialism? Well, the United States isn't the only people trying to invade and break up and to take over. France is as well. In fact, France was interested in Mexico. Recently, we had Cinco de Mayo, which is like not really a big holiday in Mexico at all, but it is in the United States because people like drinking in the United States in the name of Mexican culture. And Cinco de Mayo, people think, oh, that's Mexican Independence Day. It's not. It's actually a day that celebrates the Battle of Puebla. This was a day that French forces invaded Mexico, and actually Mexico won a battle in the Battle of Puebla over French forces. Now, more broadly, the French actually ended up conquering Mexico for a short amount of time, but that day, Cinco de Mayo, was one of the days that the Mexicans had a victory. So it says that there's this guy, Napoleon III, and he was a French leader who orchestrated the invasion of Mexico. He orchestrated the invasion of Mexico. Now, Napoleon III should probably sound familiar because he is the nephew of Napoleon I. Napoleon I was Napoleon Bonaparte, who conquered, all of Europe and caused the Napoleonic Wars and all that kind of stuff. Well, he wants to be a good Napoleon, so he orchestrates the invasion of Mexico. Now, you might remember there's something called the Monroe Doctrine, where we, the United States, said Europeans should stay out of North and South America, but we were kind of busy in the 1860s with something called the Civil War, so we couldn't say no. We weren't in a position to stop Mexico, to stop France from invading Mexico, so they did. In fact, he overthrew the president of Mexico, a guy named Benito Juarez. And Benito Juarez was actually Native American. And that was a big deal that you had this brown-skinned Native American leader of Mexico, because so many leaders of Mexico had been these fair-skinned, majority Spanish-blooded leaders that Benito Juarez was different. He was a man with a huge percentage of Native American ancestry. And that was too much for some of the white elites of Mexico who weren't all about that. And the French thought, well, we could kind of go with that anti-minority feeling and invade Mexico and have some of the rich white elites of Mexico kind of support that. And they did for a bit. It says on the handout that Napoleon III invaded and offered the Austrian noble, a guy named Archduke Maximilian, the throne. And this guy, he does. Mexico's taken over by France. There's this guy from Austria, and Napoleon III calls him up, says, hey, how would you like to be the Emperor of Mexico? He says, I would love that. And so Maximilian does. He gets a new gig as Emperor of Mexico, and Maximilian ruled Mexico from 1864 to 1867. And that's not a long time, because Mexicans actually finally forced him out of power. We, the United States, put some pressure on him because after the Civil War wraps up, we have the ability to tell France, hey man, you got to get out of Mexico, stop supporting them. And with us kind of threatening France, the French stopped supporting them. And as a result, there's an end to any of that French support for Maximilian. It says Mexicans finally forced him out. He was actually executed, and Juarez was returned to office. And so here is an example of a successful resistance. The French come in, they try to invade, they do overthrow the Mexican government, but this is an example of how the Mexican people actually successfully resist, and they kick out this conquering European force. So below that, after we talk about the French intervention in Mexico, we'll talk a little bit about South Asian movements. And in the 1800s, the British began increasingly involved in a South Asian country that we've talked about. They became involved in India. India was the place that the British were really becoming more and more involved in. And the group of people that they were really involved with was that they didn't have enough soldiers to rule India. They didn't have enough soldiers to do that. So they actually hired Indians to work for the British government. And there was a word for that. They were called sepoys. Sepoys were Indians who served as British soldiers. These are Indians who the British train and they pay and they give them guns. They are Indians who work for the British as British soldiers. And most of them were Hindu or they were Muslim. These are just local people serving in the British Army. Well, there's a problem, though, that arises because they became offended when the British started using rifle cartridges that used animal fat. So it turns out that there was a need to have uh, grease on these cartridges that was going to be made from the fat of either cows or pigs. And that's a problem because these animals were either sacred or taboo, prohibited in these different religions. It says that cows were sacred to Hindus and the pigs were prohibited in Islam. And so the British soldiers were telling the sepoys, hey man, you got to use these guns, and to reload these guns, you have to like touch and deal with either a pig fat or cow fat. And the Hindus like, well, I can't do that. It's against my religion. The Muslims like, hey, I can't do that. It's against my religion. And the British like, hey, it's not a big deal. Well, it was a big deal. And it became such a big deal that a lot of these sepoys thought, I don't think you really respect our culture. I think you just really want us to become Christian. And they probably did really want them to become Christian. But all of this was just so much that they rose up in anger and rebelled in 1857. 1857. The Sepoy Rebellion was crushed by the British. And the numbers are really incredible. Some of the numbers I saw estimate that the British killed maybe 800,000 Indians during this rebellion. I mean, I don't know if there's debate among people, but 800,000 is the number that I saw that died in the Sepoy Rebellion. That's huge. 800,000. They rebelled. They were unsuccessful to get the British out of India. This also marked the end of a period that we've talked about before. There's a couple of different empires in India. There's an empire called the Mughal Empire, and this actually brings the Mughal Empire to a close for sure. This ends the Mughal Empire. And now we enter a new phase of Indian history called the Raj. The British Raj was the name of now direct British rule in India. The Raj is the name of direct British rule in India. So now the British are not indirectly in India. They're up in India. They're ruling India directly. They're not using some company or some East India corporation. The British are ruling India directly now. In fact, the British would rule India from 1858 all the way to 1947. And though the year 47 is a big year because that's after World War II, and there's kind of like some contradictions. You know, it's like Indians actually came and fought in World War II for the British. And the British told the Indians, hey, there's this guy named Adolf Hitler. He's terrible. He's like invading people, not letting people be free, not letting them be independent. And he's ruling them against their wishes. And the Indians like, oh, that's terrible. We'll totally help you out. And Indians went and fought in World War II. But after World War II was fought, there's like this contradiction. It's like, well, wait a second. We helped you fight Adolf Hitler because he invaded countries, took away their independence and freedom, and that's bad. But wait a second. You killed 800,000 of us because we wanted our freedom and independence. There's only so much hypocrisy you can have that eventually in 47, because of leaders like Gandhi, who led non-violent peaceful protests, India received their independence in 47. So all that time, though, during the Raj, many Indian elites attended university in Great Britain. Many Indian elites attended university in Great Britain. And guess what? That's going to be good and bad because, you know, what they're going to learn in Great Britain, they're going to be exposed to Enlightenment thinking. They're going to be exposed to Enlightenment thinking. They're going to learn about social contract. They're going to learn about natural rights. They're going to learn about democracy. And the very people that conquered me are the ones giving me the tools to add another reason for why I should actually be independent. Western educated Indians would later form a group. This group would be called the Indian National Congress. This group, the Indian National Congress, it wasn't like a group that passed laws or anything like that. They were just a group of Indians who'd been Western educated who started to have the conversation for self-rule. They started the conversation for self-rule. So the Indian National Congress was not like a group of people that actually passed laws or anything. It was a group of intellectual Indians who'd been educated in the West and came back and said, well, we need to apply those Western beliefs, Enlightenment beliefs of self-rule and sovereignty and all these different things and apply it to us. And so they began the conversation talking about self-rule. Later, they're going to be like working with Gandhi in the 40s to achieve independence. Um, so India, they try militarily resisting. That's a total failure. It doesn't work out. But they do get the tools to further articulate reasons for independence when their elites go off to school and they come back with these different ideas. And that will help Gandhi later to be able to argue for independence using nonviolence methods and even appealing to Enlightenment thinking. Southeast Asian resistance, much of the region had been ruled by the Europeans, and Vietnam in particular would do their best to resist French rule. So the Vietnamese, they do what they can to resist French rule, uh, but it is with limited success. I mean, the French rule Vietnam, even if they're constantly fighting the Vietnamese people. What about the Philippines? Well, the Philippines had been conquered in the 16th century by the Spanish. And so that's why a lot of Filipinos have Spanish last names. That's why the Filipino, different languages in the Philippines have actually Spanish words inside of their languages. This is the reason that it's the only nation in Asia that is a majority Catholic, because this is the only country that Spain meaningfully ruled for 300 years. And the Spanish didn't set up any public education in the Philippines until 1863. And that's like a big deal. There's no colleges or anything. So if you are a rich Filipino, which there were rich Filipinos, and you want your kid to like be educated, where are you going to send them? You're going to send them to school in Europe. And guess what they're going to learn in Europe? They're thoughts about the Enlightenment. They're going to thoughts about democracy and capitalism, and they're going to bring those thoughts back with them. Some Filipinos elites sent their children to study in Europe. And while they were there, they were exposed to Enlightenment thinking. There's my wife. They're exposed to Enlightenment thinking, this one. It says, as they were exposed to Enlightenment thinking, they're going to bring that back with them. They're going to bring that back with them. One leader of one Filipino reform group, one group called the Philippine League, actually that guy was executed. So what they did was that they started just to execute people they thought were threats. And that's the thing, is like ideas can be dangerous. Enlightenment thinking can be dangerous. We need to execute, we need to kill, we need to like knock out these different people. And now the US actually gets involved in the Philippines. We've talked about this before. The US became interested in the Philippines in 1898 during a conflict we had with Spain. You might remember there's something called the Spanish-American War, because Spain and America went to war. And so we called that the Spanish-American War. And that was a real easy victory for us, the US. In fact, the US quickly defeated Spain. We quickly defeated Spain. And the Filipinos at first were like super excited. They're like, wow, that's great. Like the United States defeated Spain. And they thought, well, if the United States defeated Spain, surely they're going to be all about us having our independence. They thought surely the United States is going to support the Filipino people being free. But that was not what we, the United States, went into the Philippines for. The Filipino people quickly, they expected support for their independence. When the United States came, like, oh, thank God you're here. The Spanish ruled us. They were brutal. They didn't let us be free. Thank God the Americans were here, was how some of them thought. They expected we would support their independence. Instead, the United States declared the Philippines as a U.S. territory. A U.S. territory. You know, there's a lot of parts of the United States that are not states, but owned by the United States. Puerto Rico to this day is a territory. It's not a state, but it's owned by the United States. It's part of the United States. You're born in Puerto Rico, you're an American citizen. There's Guam. Guam is part of the United States. If you're born in Guam, you're a U.S. citizen. You're closer to Hong Kong than you are to L.A., but you're in the United States in Guam. And so there's these different islands all around the world owned by the United States. And the Philippines, for a period of time, is part of the United States. It says the Filipinos, instead the U.S. declared the Philippines part of as a U.S. territory, and there was something called the Philippine-American War, and it was from 1899 to 1902. The U.S. fought to stop Filipino independence. We fought this war to stop the Philippines from having their independence. And this war had some tragic results. How many Filipino soldiers died? About 20,000 Filipino soldiers died as they fought for their independence. How many Filipino civilians were killed? 200,000. 200,000. That's women and children. And there was actually, sadly for us, some even like concentration camp like situations that our military set up. 200,000 civilians. And for us, it wasn't easy for us either. 4,300 Americans died as a result. 4,300. To give you some context, 3,000 Americans died in 9/11. And so this war that no one ever talks about or you ever hear about, more Americans died here than in 9/11. 2/3 of those Americans died from disease. And the Philippines, 2/3 died from disease. The Philippines was part of the United States all the way until 1946. After World War II, another thing, if we fight against Nazi Germany because Hitler's such a bad guy because he doesn't let people be free, it's kind of ironic to hold on to the Philippines and kill 250,000 of them. And on one hand say, oh yeah, you should not like Hitler. Hitler's bad. He invaded and didn't let people be free. And we did the exact same thing to the Filipino people. So as a result, 46, we let the Philippines get their independence. Moving south to Australia and New Zealand, the Aborigines were the original people of Australia. They're the original people of Australia. And the population of the Aborigines before Europeans was about 1 million. There's 1 million of these native dark-skinned people in Australia that were there before white people showed up. How many tribes of Aborigines? There was like 500 different tribes. And how many different languages did they speak? There were 700 different languages. Just like when we talk about Africa, there's so many tribes and so many different languages. So many people speak 5 or 6 different languages. That's how Australia was as well. But then white settlers began to show up, especially after the 13 colonies got their independence. The British are looking to expand, and Australia is a continent ready for conquest. In 1788, Australia became a home to convicts and to colonists. Now, convict, you might remember, is a person who's been to prison. And that's what Australia was. It was a place where we would send prisoners. It was a place where we would go and, send people who were undesirable, convicts and colonists who were making their way down to Australia. So that's what we see happening there. It says the colonial government did not recognize native land claims. They didn't claim the native. They didn't believe the Aborigines owned the land. They ignored those land claims. And this is a common theme. We see this a lot. The Aborigines also were not citizens and therefore were not protected by laws. And so these Aborigines, they didn't even have legal protections that their white neighbors did. And so it was not a good situation for them at all. It says the population of the Aborigines declined due to disease and to killing. They used to be 100% of the population of Australia were these dark-skinned native people. Today, Aborigines only make up 3% of the population of Australia. Just like Native Americans in the United States. They were 100% of the United States with Native Americans. Today, it's like 3%. Same thing, the Aborigines as well. And so they were killed and hunted on purpose. What about New Zealand? If you take a look at the map, the people of New Zealand are different than the people of Australia. In New Zealand, the native people are a group of people called the Maori. Now, the Maori, there's a famous person who's half Jewish, half Maori. That's Taika Waititi, the director of Jojo Rabbit and Thor Ragnarok. His Maori ancestry is, if you look at the map, from Polynesia. They're a Polynesian group of people. Most of the people arrived in the 14th century from Polynesia. And these Polynesian people, they were sailors. If you remember Moana, that's the people of Moana sail and settle from Madagascar to Hawaii to New Zealand. That's who they are. Despite their armed resistance, the Maori were pressured to sell their land. And the Maori also pushed off their land. They do not successfully resist Europeans. What about Africa? Well, there was a lot of syncretism in West African Islam. Syncretism is when you mix beliefs and mix practices, and there was a lot of mixed belief and practices in West African Islam. There was a lot of mixing Islam with folk practices, mixing Islam with folk practices. So some Muslims thought that's not cool, we shouldn't be changing Islam, we shouldn't be doing anything like that. And so there's a guy named Usman Dan Fodio, and he led a move to purify Islam. He wanted to get rid of all the stuff that wasn't right, all the stuff that wasn't true, all the stuff that was not pure. And he has a new government called the Sokoto Caliphate based on Islam. And it stressed slavery as a means for economic growth, that we can make money by capturing slaves, selling slaves. There's a lot of slavery that they pushed. In fact, here's a picture, not in West Africa, but in East Africa, in another Muslim empire that had an East African slave boy in 1890. Now, you might remember most of the Western world got rid of slavery, but not in East Africa. They held on, not in much of the Muslim world, because Muhammad owned slaves and it wasn't considered wrong to own slaves. And so here's this boy. You might remember that the Ottoman Empire had slavery all the way until 1908. The Ottoman Empire had slavery. Saudi Arabia didn't get rid of slavery until 1962. I mean, that's late, but the last country to get rid of slavery was a Muslim country called Mauritania. They didn't get rid of slavery until 1981. 1981 is when they got rid of slavery. In fact, even people today argue maybe slavery should be okay. One guy who argues slavery should be okay is a Muslim cleric, a Muslim leader. He's a member of Saudi Arabia's highest religious body called the Senior Council of Clerics. And he issued a fatwa. That word fatwa is a religious ruling. It is a religious ruling. It is a opinion based on the Quran. I have my trash guys coming. A fatwa, a religious ruling, and he said that slavery is a part of Islam. Slavery is part of jihad, and jihad will remain as long as there is Islam. So even people in the 21st century say, you know what, slavery is okay. As long as there is Islam, it's okay for there to be slavery. In fact, he went on to say, any Muslim who disagrees is a non-Muslim. Any Muslim who disagrees is a non-Muslim. So this guy who's super popular in Saudi Arabia said, slavery is okay in certain situations, and if you disagree, you're not even a good Muslim. This place, the practice of slavery, well, the practice of slavery placed this Sokoto Caliphate at odds with the British. It placed them at odds with the British. Because it placed them at odds with the British. This is like rush hour. I've got dogs. I have teenage daughters. Get out of here.
I told you that was
Goodness gracious. Rush hour in my front porch. Where's I got trash people. I've got my dog, my daughter. What's going on here? So anyway, this brought them in conflict with the British Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, because the British at this time were not all about slavery. In fact, the British had been inspired by evangelical Christians in their time to actually end slavery. There was a big push to end slavery. And the British actually even used their navy to free slaves. And so the Sokoto Caliphate became part of the British Empire in 1903. So Islam inspired them to do their practices, but it wasn't enough to get them independent. What about South Africa? Well, there's a group of people in South Africa called the Xhosa, and these people resisted British rule, the Xhosa. And there was a local prophet that encouraged the Xhosa people to kill their own cattle, believing it would cause the Xhosa ancestors to come back from the dead. They basically said, hey, if we kill all of our own cattle, the ancestors, our dead ancestors, will rise from the dead and kick out all the white people. This is an example of millenarianism. Just like the ghost dance Native Americans believed that their ancestors would come back and kick out the white people, in South Africa, the Xhosa people believe if we kill all of our own animals, it's going to upset the ancestors so much that they're going to rise from the dead and drive out all the whites from South Africa. This example of millenarianism is partly inspired by Christianity. They had Christian missionaries that talked about resurrection, and this kind of inspired their thinking just a little bit. As a result of this, the Xhosa killed about 40,000 of their own cattle. 40,000 of their own cattle. And turns out they killed all that cattle, but guess who didn't go away? White people didn't go away. The Xhosa cattle killing movement resulted in two things. It wasn't independence. It resulted in famine and starvation. Famine and starvation. It turns out the white people weren't driven away. Their dead ancestors didn't resurrect. They didn't come back from the dead. At the end of the day, the British remained in power. The British also fought and defeated another South African group that were famous fighters, famous warriors. They were brave, but bravery can only go so far against bullets. The British also fought and defeated the Zulu in the 1870s. The Zulu were defeated in the 1870s. Here's a picture on your handout of the Xhosa spiritual leader on the right and her fellow prophet on the left. These are two prophets, and they were partly inspired by ideas of Christianity, ideas of resurrection, ideas of the end of the world. And this prophet had taught their people that the whites would go away. They just killed their own animals. They killed their own animals. The whites didn't go away. Finally, East African responses in the Sudan. There's a man named Muhammad Ahmed, and he claimed to be a person called the Mahdi. And this Mahdi was someone who was a so-called guided one. And that's what the word Mahdi kind of means. It's a guided one. And some Muslims believe that at the end of the world, there would be a Mahdi, a religious figure who would lead to the restoration of a Muslim kingdom on earth. And this man from the Sudan claimed to be exactly that, the Mahdi. He claimed he was an person, an end times person who would restore Islam. He would restore Islam. He believed that he was a spiritual leader for the end of the world, and that if people would just follow him religiously, Islam would be restored, everything would be magical, everything would be great. And he led a rebellion against the British. He, inspired by his religious belief that he was the Mahdi, this religious leader, this Islamic leader, he rebelled against the British. And because bravery can only go so far against bullets, the British defeated this millenarian movement in 1898. So final thoughts, there are three different ways that indigenous people deal with European resistance. One is to adopt culture. One is to adopt culture. This is one thing that non-Europeans do to resist. They adopt culture. The Cherokee, for example, they adopted European culture, thinking it would save them. They westernized. They began to practice Christianity, do these things, and it did not save them. So practicing white culture was one way. Another thing that was a reason for resistance was Western education. A lot of these people, whether it was Indians getting educated in Britain, Filipinos getting educated in Europe, a lot of these leaders got some of their ideas for resistance from white European books about democracy, about freedom, about social contract, about the Enlightenment. So Western education actually helps fuel it. And the third is religion. It is religion that causes the Xhosa to kill their own cattle. It is religion that causes the ghost dancers to dance, thinking they're going to bring the end of the world, wiping out white people. It is religion that causes the Mahdi movement in Sudan to rise up, thinking that the end of the world's going to come and Islam is going to reign the day. Most of these movements are not successful. In fact, the successful movement that we can point to is, Mexico driving out the French. But other than that, broadly in the 1800s, non-white Europeans are on the losing side. They won't get the freedom they desire, no matter how inspired by Western ideas. They won't get the freedom that they desire, no matter how much their religion gives them the strength to resist. That won't be something that won't happen until the 1900s, when the end of World War II causes a lot of European powers to say there's some hypocrisy here that we might need to address. Thanks a lot. Stay safe. I look forward to seeing you guys again.